Thank you very much, Iverna and the panelists. It was a great session on a very important topic. Listening and delivering to meet people's expectations, I think, are two key issues that you discussed and gave us great insights on. So thank you again. I think we have a short time to move from one room to another room. So I'm just telling you that in this room, we will have the session on the Ukraine and the session on green democracy and on women's democratic representation that will take up some of the issues that were discussed right now, will be in the banquet room and room D. So if you need to change room, please do so. And we're waiting for the other participants from the previous session, parallel sessions, to join us in 5 minutes. But please reconvene in 5 minutes because we are indeed late. 2 minutes? All right, please take your seats. Welcome to this second parallel session of this afternoon on accountable public administrations for the stronger democracies in Eastern and Southeastern Europe and MENA, with a focus on the Ukraine. As I said in the opening session, we are honored to have with us Minister Ole Nemchikov, who I'm glad to see again among us. This session is an opportunity to actually consider the impact the war in Ukraine will have on the development of democracy and good governance in eastern and southern part of Europe, and the support that is required to ensure that it continues to be strengthened in the region. So to discuss these issues, I would like to invite Gregor Virant, who is the head of Sigma in the Public Governance Directorate at the OECD, who is going to moderate the panel, and all the panelists for this session. Please come on stage.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us. I'm sure we have a lot of audience also online. At the moment, it will be an interesting session. It will be a session with regional or geographic focus, if you wish. So thank you for the introduction. I'm indeed head of Sigma. Let me say a few words about Sigma. It's a joint program of the OECD and the EU, principally financed by the EU, established 30 years ago to support public administration reforms in the countries of EU enlargement and neighborhood. These are 3 regions. Currently, we are working with 3 regions. It is the European Eastern neighborhood or partnership, it's the Western Balkans, and it's the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. And this session will be about these 3 regions. Now, you have heard in the morning, and we all know that even the OECD member states, among which you can find the most advanced and oldest democracies in the world, face significant challenges when it comes to democracy. And of course, the countries in transition, at the same time, have to cope with some basic issues, with some basic challenges of democracy. And this is what we will be talking about. Let me introduce to you our panelists. We have with us Mr. Oleg Nemchinov, who is coming from the country which is, as we speak, fighting literally on the battlefield, not only for their own freedom and democracy, but for the protection of the values of the free world, among which democracy is the paramount. We have with us two representatives of the OECD member states. We have Mrs. Sanja Ajanović-Hovnik, who is the Minister of Public Administration of Slovenia. We have Mrs. Lina Veltrakiene, the permanent representative of Lithuania to the OECD. We have two ministers from the Western Balkans, to be more precise, two deputy prime ministers. Deputy Prime Minister Jovan Amarović from Montenegro, responsible for European integration. Deputy Prime Minister Slavica Grkovska from North Macedonia, responsible for public governance reforms. Then we have with us Monsieur Mathieu Bousquet, who is acting director of directorate within the DG NEAR, Neighborhood and Enlargement. And we have also academia. We have Mr. Sofian Sahrawi, director of the International Institute of Administrative Sciences. Now, we don't have much time, so without further ado, I will get straight to the business at hand and start with Minister Nemchinov. Minister Nemchinov, first of all, thank you so much for being with us today. We can imagine how difficult it must have been for you to separate even for a few days from Kiev, and how difficult the trip must have been. It took you 2 days to get from Kiev to here. Now, Ukraine is a democratic country. You elect your leaders in free and democratic elections. At the same time, your democracy is young and vulnerable and is currently under attack by a hostile neighboring dictatorship who wants to destroy your democracy. What does democracy mean to the people of Ukraine? And in your opinion, how did the Russian war of aggression change this attitude?
Дякую. Насправді, я вже казав сьогодні колегам, коли багато спілкувався, що доля міністра не така погана в порівнянні з долею пересічного українця. І незручності пов'язані з тим, що ти не можеш вилетіти з улюбленого Борисполя і прилетіти напряму в Люксембурзі чи в Брюсселі, це ніщо в порівнянні з тим, що переживають люди, які знаходяться під щоденними обстрілами чи не мають електрики тижнями і позбавлені роботи і всього іншого. Але менше з тим. Я дякую за запитання, тому що в ньому фактично є і відповідь. Україна відносно молода держава, але держава з величезним історичним минулим. І це історичне минуле не розпочалося на Євромайдані 2014 року. Це минуло починаючи з глибоких корінь. Наша війна сучасна з Російською Федерацією – це тільки одна з невеликих складових великої боротьби українців за свою незалежність. Ми зазнавали багатьох поразок, але зараз, завдяки підтримки демократичних країн Європи, Північної Америки і всього світу, ми боремося саме для того, щоб, як казав Грегорі, ми самі обирали свій лад. Не для того, щоб в Мінськ сідав літак з якоюсь особою, яка мала там через 3 дні після нападу Росії на Україну зайняти місце в президентському палаці. Не тих гауляйтерів, яких призначали в Херсоні, а зараз вони вже в іншому світі. І я говорю його не віртуально, а реально вони в іншому світі, тому що самі ж ті, хто їх призначав, їх знищують. Це той процес, який ми зупинили в Харкові в вересні під час наступу, коли фактично була звільнена майже вся Харківщина, і ще до того, як фейкові референдуми відбувалися на території окупованих частин Херсонської, Запорізької, Донецької, Луганської областях, які ворог на той момент повністю не контролював, і навіть не контролював там обласний центр Запоріжжя, ми такі самі документи з такими самими результатами знаходили в Куп'янську, в Ізюмі, в Балаклеї і інших міст Харківщини. Саме заради цього ми боремось, саме заради того, щоб українці і наші сусіди мали можливість обирати свою владу в демократичний спосіб. Ми самі хочемо вирішувати свої питання в межах своєї країни. Ми хочемо жити в європейській родині. І саме тому Україна обрала шлях європейської інтеграції. І коли в 2013 році попередній президент України відмовився від цього шляху, українці повстали. І в мирний спосіб, не позбавляючи його влади, він сам втік з меж України, вони провели нові вибори, обрали нового президента, який в такий самий демократичний спосіб програв наступні вибори, і прийшов новий президент. І це абсолютно нормально, коли громадяни голосують самі, а їм не призначають гауляйтери сусідні держави. Тому ми будемо боротися, ми дякуємо всім за допомогу, і ми будемо виборювати свою незалежність для того, щоб і наші сусіди в подальшому її зберегли. Тому що, хоча ми є молода країна, ми пам'ятаємо, що таке втратити незалежність. Я переконаний, що якби Україна встояла в боротьбі початку минулого століття, не було б 39-го року ні для Польщі, ні для Литви, ні для Естонії, ні для Латвії, ні тим більше для країн Західного світу. І ніхто би не думав у вересні 39-го року, що літом 40-го року Люксембург буде окуповано. Дякую.
Thank you so much for your answer, which makes us aware once again that democracy is not for granted. Now, Ambassador Viltrakiene, how does Lithuania, as an EU and OECD member state bordering Russia, see Ukraine's future? And why do you think it is so important for the EU member states and for the OECD member states that Ukraine wins this war and preserves freedom and democracy?
Okay, thank you very much for the question, and well, encouraged by the speech of the minister, definitely I would like to start perhaps with the second question you asked, why it is important that Ukraine wins the war, first of all. We have to realize that today's Russia is an existential threat to all Europe and also to the whole world community. In the last decades, Kremlin has been using these periods of relative calm only to regain its military strength and to continue with the aggression on a larger scale. Let's remember, let's not forget, Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, then invasion of Ukraine in 2014, now we have 2022. So if Russia's aggression is not stopped, it will be continuing, and it will be continuing elsewhere, neighboring countries being first in aggressors' radar. Moreover, Russia is weaponizing energy and food security to blackmail the international community, causing an existential threat to the most vulnerable countries in the world. In addition to that, Russia employs disinformation as a weapon of war, spreading fake narratives globally that threaten international security and democratic values. So that is why the war in Ukraine is also in part, a war between autocracy against and democracy, autocracy against democracy. So Putin is seeking to revise international rules-based system which ensures sovereignty, security, and prosperity. There is no doubt that autocratic regimes are following closely the situation in Ukraine and monitoring how international community is responding to war. If they see that violence works, we are in risk of having other invasions. And definitely that further increases autocratic powers and as well declines in democracy, in human rights, in economic prosperity. So that is why, indeed, we need and we have to stand by Ukraine, we have to support Ukraine and to make Ukraine to achieve victory and Russia to pay for its for its war crimes. Very briefly, how do we see Ukraine's future? Well, of course, first of all, we really see that Ukraine wins the war rather sooner, the sooner the better. We see reconstructed Ukraine, a reconstructed, built back better. And definitely we see Ukraine as a part of the EU, a part of NATO, and a part of the OECD. First steps have already been taken. We granted the EU candidate status to Ukraine. Ukraine is a prospective member to OECD, and we decided to start initial accession dialogue here at OECD with Ukraine. And we look forward to the positive decisions in 2023 NATO summit, which will be hosted by Lithuania and will take place in July in Vilnius.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we all share your views here, and we are more and more aware how right you have been all the time. I'm talking about the Baltic countries. Mr. Bousquet, now we have two new EU candidate countries from the Eastern Neighborhood region or the Eastern Partnership region. There's a whole new dynamic in the accession process. And we also know that democratic governance is one of the fundamentals of the EU accession process, because democracy is one of the key, the fundamental values of the European Union. So how do you see the state of play, the situation in the area of democratic governance and the perspectives, the way forward for the EU candidate countries and potential candidates in the area of democratic governance, especially in the context of this new geopolitical situation, the war, and of course, the new dynamics of the enlargement process?
Thank you. I mean, we have to, of course, I mean, we're all fighting for democracy, but we need to see also in an accession process, I mean, what is a democracy and how to look at a democracy. And in the revised enlargement methodologies that we published in 2020, we looked at how we can characterize a democracy. It's based basically on three pillars, and this is what we are discussing when we started the negotiation of accession with Albania and North Macedonia. The first one is the electoral process. Free and fair elections, as the Minister of Ukraine said, but also protecting free media in the election campaign, integrity of funding of political parties and election campaigns. So this is very much about, I mean, ensuring that the elections are free and fair and can lead to solid governments. Of course, functioning of national parliament is essential. And here we want to ensure that the parliament has the capacity to get the highest standards of integrity. We talked about it this morning, transparency, accountability, but also effectiveness. And one of the key elements is, of course, the control, what we call the oversight of the parliament on the executive. And the third point, which will not be forgotten, and that was the previous session, is about civil society. Either in a democracy, in the partner countries that are negotiating the accession, the political context, which is favorable to having an active civil society, either the legal framework, and either the enabling environment. So that are the conditions that we look at, and we do not look only at the commitment of the government to ensure that, but we assess the performance. So now coming to the challenges. It's public. We published our latest enlargement package. We published the Commission opinion on the application for membership of the Georgia, Republic of Moldova, and Ukraine. But let me highlight 2 or 3 points. First one, what we see in our assessment is that we need to have a stable and genuine political will to build strong and stable democratic institutions, and this is uneven, sometimes even lacking. Let me take a very concrete example. We see in many countries an excessive use of shortened proceedings, so exceptions. And this is, basically a way to hamper democracy, accountability, and this is where, also the parliament has, in its oversight capacity, is key. So that's just one element of the functioning of a democracy. If 90% of your law you're using the exceptions, it seems it doesn't work. The second element is certainly about disinformation and polarization. By disinformation, this can come from state actors, from non-state actors, and as we know, from local actors or actors coming from abroad. We have clear examples of actors and autocracies working on disinforming. So the development of negative, false narrative about democracy, undermining the public trust in democratic institutions, and discrediting the EU, that deepens polarization, and we can see even in some countries fueling ethnic or religious divides. So this is a major area where we see a challenge, and we need to address that, because otherwise we are very much moving into a polarization which is not good for the democratic institutions. And the third point I would say is related to corruption. Corruption, we need to talk about it. It's a threat to democracy. So the way, really to develop anti-corruption measures, the need to address state capture. This, of course, goes hand in hand with a good functioning of the judiciary. So to have a judiciary which is both accountable and independent, that are the 2 sides of the same coin, and efficient. So that are some of the challenges that we are seeing in the different countries.
Thank you very much. And I think we will all agree that even some EU and OECD member states share some of these very basic challenges of democracy. Now we move to the Western Balkans. Let's not forget that this region saw horrible, atrocious wars just less than 3 decades ago, in the 90s. If Western Europe has already forgotten about it a little bit, I'm sure the memory is still very much alive in the Western Balkans. So my question for you, Deputy Prime Minister Marovic, would be, what are the impacts of the war, of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine in the region of Western Balkans?
Thank you for the question. But as you said, the democracy in the Western Balkans has never been in a good health. That's basically because we went through the war during the 90s, and then because of the political elites which were focused just to stay in power and not on democracy and human rights and reforms. And then when we started the reforms within the EU conditionality and within the framework of the EU, there were lots of ups and downs in the EU's approach towards the Western Balkans. The EU is still successful in providing framework for democracy, but not democracy in practice. And when I'm saying that, I am using the example of Montenegro, which is the most successful country in the Western Balkans when it comes to reforms in the European integration process. And when you try to compare the level of democracy now and 10 years ago when Montenegro started the negotiations, it's almost the same. The progress can be measured by the technical criteria, some laws and strategies, but in practice all these levels and all these areas as elections, as the freedom of media and all the rest, there are still big issues which we are sharing with the rest of the Western Balkans. But then when there are some wake-up calls, and the wake-up call for Europe and for the European Union was a long time ago, but now with the war in Europe, there are some red flags for both the Western Balkans and for the European Union. When we are discussing the role of the Western Balkans now in achieving and building democracy, I think that there is need, of course, for the solidarity with the people of Ukraine, with Ukraine, because this is something to stand for democratic values, and also to stand with the country which is really attacked by an independent country which is attacked, and in that sense, democratic values are attacked. That's the first thing, and that all the Western Balkan countries has to be fully aligned with the EU common foreign and security policy, which means with the sanctions against Russia. Montenegro is really successful in that sense because we introduced the aid package of the sanctions towards Russia, and we are fully aligned with the EU common foreign and security policy. But this is just the first step. The second one is that those countries which are not aligned should be punished. That's the sense and that's the meaning of the new methodology of the European Commission. Those countries which are successful in achieving the standards should be, there should be some benefits for those countries, and those which are not should be punished in that sense with some sanctions. But we are missing completely that part of the new EU methodology, so that means that we really need, from the EU level, to have this part developed and to see what are the benefits of alignment with the EU policies. Then I think that now I will focus more, of course, on the EU because, as in the church, you know, the more responsibility is on a priest and not on a believer. That means if there's someone which can provide democracy, that's the European Union. That's why we're still waiting for the EU to develop some better mechanisms to safeguard democracy, because democracy is endangered not just in the Western Balkans, but also in the EU member states, but also at the EU level. So that means that the EU should develop better tools from those which are in the EU Treaty on Functioning of the EU. That means that we need better mechanisms for the rule of law and for the protecting the rule of law at all the levels. The EU should keep and should help better the rule of law at all levels, as I said, and these strengthening should go hand in hand. If they want to develop new mechanisms and if they want to test new mechanisms, they should use the Western Balkans in order, you know, like as a case study, to use the Western Balkans as the case study, and then they use the same mechanisms in the EU member states. Then the EU should speak with one voice. There were recent cases when the EU officials and the member states were not aligned when it comes to some developments in the Western Balkans, some local initiatives or some local developments in the Western Balkans. So you have the President of the European Council and the EU Commissioner for Neighbourhood with one voice and with one statement, And then you have EU member states with different statements. So that means that the EU should have and should speak with one voice when it comes to democracy and the Western Balkans. Then, as I said, that there should be more concrete benefits for the citizens of the Western Balkans. Citizens in Montenegro, they are supporting the EU membership. 76% of them are for the EU membership, even after 10 years of the negotiations for the EU membership. So it's even difficult for me, and I'm leading the European integration process in the country, to explain what is the European perspective of the Western Balkans. And the citizens are still believe that the EU is the place where we need to be, and that the EU is a place where the democratic values are, and where they are developing and they are framing the democratic values. So in that sense, I think that we really need more benefits from the roaming prices and from the RICO office or some other benefits which we experience in the recent years. And then finally, I think that it's good to have the Berlin process and the regional initiatives, and we are clearly devoted to those regional initiatives, but I think that the European perspective is the motivated factor for the democracy and democratization of the Western Balkans. So in that sense, it's not that we need the deadline, but we need really clear messages and real concrete actions from the European Union that the future of the Western Balkans is really in the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and these are really very good suggestions to the European Union, and it's fully legitimate that this enlargement process and the discussions are a two-way process. The European Union, the European Commission comes to the candidate countries with a lot of recommendations and requirements, and sometimes it's fully legitimate. You also have certain requirements for the European Union, given how much effort you are investing in the process. We now move to the south. We move to the MENA region. Mr. Sahrawi, you are a specialist for the region. You have been following the developments in public governance in Arab countries for a very, very long time. So what is your take? Where are we? What are the prospects of democratic governance in the Arab world more than 10 years after that huge moment of hope, the Arab Spring? Where are we today and where are we heading?
Thank you, Gregor. I mean, if I were to give an immediate answer, it would not be positive, basically. The prospects are bleak, and I would even say dark overall. Now, the last, if I may call it, minaret of democracy post-Arab Spring has just partially extinguished, which is Tunisia. And he has ever engaged in a path, an autocratic path, the like of which he has not witnessed since its independence in 1956. Of course, the other countries had already folded down any type of democratic path. Now, and it is even worse, you know, for other countries in the region. I mean, as you all know, I mean, looking across the region, we have civil wars that are still very much active, and here I could mention Syria, Libya, or Yemen. These are obviously countries in very dire conditions. And even when in other places where there are no civil wars, I mean, the situation is not very good either. Of course, I will qualify all of this. I mean, I'll start with the downturn, and then I will come back to show that there is light at the end of the tunnel in the end. Now, you know, I would like to seize this opportunity because I'm in an OECD forum to say that it is unfortunate that many countries, including prominent OECD countries, did not always stand on the good side of history. By good, I mean to defend the values of democracy, freedom, and human rights. and like what the Honorable Prime Minister of Luxembourg said this morning, they have not unequivocally expressed their disapproval of the downturn that countries of the region have taken. I've been listening here throughout the day and right now by Minister Nemchov to what has been said about Ukraine, and I fully appreciate all the support Ukraine is getting. But the stand of OECD countries has not been moved by the same drive elsewhere. Notwithstanding, of course, I seize this opportunity to express my full solidarity with the people of Ukraine and their plight. That obviously is indisputable. Now, let me be a little bit more positive, of course, because I'm by nature optimistic, and not only optimistic, also I have a certain reading of history that allows me to look positively at the future. There are some countries that, though not achieving democratic standards as defined in the West, but they manage somehow, to put forth some reforms that offer significant benefits to their people. In this respect, I can mention maybe Morocco, Jordan, Bahrain, or Qatar. These are examples. Even in countries where democratic transitions flopped, and again, I go back to the case of Tunisia, 10 years of democratic apprenticeship, and I call it democratic apprenticeship, have unleashed the creative potential of people and civil society, to confirm what Mathieu has said before. So the reversal of fortunes for the Arab Spring has not undone people's lust for freedom and good governance, right? There is no doubt in my mind that rule of law will be established or re-established in Tunisia and across the region in the foreseeable future. The Arab Spring is not over. What happened in 2011 is only a first wave of it. A second wave, fueled by the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Ukraine war, because they have created objective conditions for change to happen again, and is slowly gathering speed and will manifest across the region. My belief is that it will bring a more resilient form of democracy. When you build democracy, you just don't build it at once. It is true that the values are easy to espouse, but as we were discussing outside, there are tools for democracies that people have to learn to use and to work with. And at the end, this is why I call it apprenticeship, because you have to learn to be democratic and to know how to exercise this democracy. My belief is that this resilient form of democracy will happen in countries with high readiness. And when I say high readiness, I mean countries like Morocco, Tunisia, or Jordan, of course, because the objective conditions of this country make them more prone to move into democracy. Even countries like Libya could also take a shortcut towards this path as well. Inevitably, all will follow suit in the subsequent waves of the Arab Spring. And here I'm not talking about the 100 years ahead. I think this will happen much sooner than a lot of people think. And just to dispel a little bit a myth that maybe democracy is not for everybody. I truly believe that democracy is universal value because it's premised on freedom, and people, they lust for freedom wherever they are, whatever their religion is, whatever their culture is. And once they experience it, they will pursue it until they get it. This is besides the fact that democracy is the only guarantee for people to have a say on the public affairs of their countries.
Thank you very much for your realistically optimistic views, and we all wish they really come true. I would hope you also had a similar forecast for Russia, for example. But this is it for the first round of discussion. We are now moving to the second round and the last round of discussion, which is about public governance or public administration reforms and trust. Now, public administration reforms are not vital only for EU accession and for creating a level playing field and shared values with the OECD member states. Public administration reforms are crucial for the competitiveness of countries and ultimately for prosperity and well-being of the citizens. So we will be discussing public administration reforms and trust, and we will again start with Ukraine. Minister Nemchinov, the Ukrainian government and public institution, and especially the president, currently enjoy an unmatched level of trust of the public. When the war is over and when this rally around the flag effect will slowly, gradually, eventually fade away, what will be crucial for the public institution to maintain a solid level of trust, in your opinion?
Дякую. Важко просто відповісти на це питання. Насправді, якщо подивитися динаміку рейтингу довіри до президента, парламенту і уряду до 24 лютого, то починаючи з 2019 року, вона була подібна на електрокардіограму. І, звичайно, що консолідація нації навколо політичного керівництва в умовах відкритої збройної агресії є процесом відповіді суспільства на дії влади. Я думаю, що нема в Україні жодного політика, який би вважав, що так буде завжди. І переконаний, що як президент, так і члени парламенту, і тим більше члени уряду це прекрасно розуміють. В нашому уряді вже за час збройної агресії відбулося декілька кадрових змін. Це процес об'єктивний. Це говорить про те, що ми, як парламентсько-президентська демократія, працюємо, і парламент приймає, і коаліція в парламенті, якої є монобільшість політичної партії «Слуга народу», приймають відповідні рішення. Немає індульгенції на час воєнного стану. Якщо керівник має бути на іншому місці, так як відбулося з міністром Чернишовим, який пішов з міністерської посади на позицію керівника найбільшої нафтогазової компанії в Україні, на «Нафтогаз України», значить, так треба було зробити. І в даному випадку я переконаний, що ми свідомі того, що той високий рейтинг довіри, який зараз є до всієї влади в Україні, це, по-перше, не є індульгенції для прийняття неправомірних рішень. По-друге, так не буде весь час. І по-третє, коли закінчиться війна і з війни повернеться понад 1 мільйон ветеранів, їхнє відчуття справедливості буде настільки загостреним, що будь-який уряд, парламент і президент буде під дуже щільною увагою суспільства. Тому для нас важливо завершити реформу держуправління зараз, не відкладати її на час після війни, проводити антикорупційну реформу і прозоро обрати керівників Національної агенції з управління арештованими активами, директора Національної агенції боротьби з корупцією. І для того, щоб в першу чергу в українського суспільства не було питання про незалежність антикорупційних органів, завершення судової реформи, завершення реформи загалом публічної адміністрації. Ми все це робимо не для того, щоб комусь щось довести. Ми це робимо для себе. Тому що коли українці борються за свою незалежність, вони борються в тому числі за майбутнє своїх дітей, які повинні жити в демократичній країні, з прозорими процедурами і з довірою суспільства до влади. Дякую.
Thank you very much. Minister Hovnik, Slovenia has accomplished a successful process of accession to the EU and to the OECD, and has now come of age, at least when it comes to the EU. It's been now more than 20 years since accession. What were the most successful elements of public administration reform that reinforced trust in public institutions?
Thank you very much. As we are running late, I won't be too long. So, first, I would like to stress out my personal opinion that public administration reform is an ongoing process. It never stops. And second, citizens' trust must be earned. We cannot take it for granted. So, key aspects related to increasing the citizens' trust in institutions is openness of the public administration and engaging with the public, transparency, clear communication, and up-to-date feedback to the public. These would be key aspects. It is essential to engage with the public at both preventive and curative way. So, public must be involved in the policy-making process in a timely manner, and also, at the same time, we should provide them with the transparent feedback on their previous suggestions. As members of the OECD, we are in constant contact with the expert team of individual committees who, with their recommendations, help us make improvements in various areas, which are important for raising public trust in public institutions. Based on OECD reviews in various areas and studies with recommendation, we prepare action plans with concrete measures aimed at improving the area. A concrete example from the field of regulatory policy is in July 2019 adopted by the Slovenian government action plan to improve the regulatory drafting process and quality of regulation. So we take quality of regulation very seriously. The project aims at introduction impact assessment of regulations in several areas, such as social, environment, IT solutions, administrative implicants, public finance, introduction of a model for ex post evaluation of regulation. Throughout all the activities, our aim is to first increase the trust of all citizens, second, to raise awareness of the importance of participation, co-creation, co-design of the development process, third, to prepare more evidence-based policies, fourth, to develop more systematic solutions, and last but not least, to increase the efficiency of government and public institutions.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Viltratiene, may I ask you the same question? Could you share any specific example of good practice or a lesson learned from the experience of Lithuania in the area of public administration reform with the aim of reinforcing trust in institutions?
Well, if you allow me, perhaps I would briefly mention several examples that could be really useful on a way to EU integration of the countries, and in particular Ukraine, as we are focusing this session on Ukraine. So we really believe that negotiations on the EU membership with Ukraine and Moldova will start in already next year, hopefully. And then it would be really, well, from our own experience, we have to say that it is really, really very important to find the best suited formula for the accession process and really to set up an efficient structure to coordinate the accession negotiations and also the whole EU integration process. So, and in this objective, perhaps I would like to mention three instruments or three processes which were very, very helpful to Lithuania, and we support now the use of them very much. Of course, first of all, candidate countries have to rely on technical assistance coming from the EU, the financial and export assistance, and definitely intensive use of initiatives such as trainings and TAIEX. They bring the expertise of the EU member states to the current candidate countries in order to help addressing their specific needs. And also active use of the instrument for pre-accession assistance 3 is really very important tool to deepen the accession reforms. Lithuania is really ready to share its own experience, and for example, together with our partners, we have been implementing the EU-funded program Support to Public Financial Management in Ukraine. So this is well, just a simple example. Another process which I wanted to mention is the accession to the OECD process, and indeed, we support very much the aspiration of Ukraine and other countries to become the members of OECD. In the case of Ukraine, we really see that accession to the EU and OECD are complementary processes, are mutually supportive processes. And well, the simplest example that comes to my mind is the Ukraine's request to become a participant in the OECD Working Party on bribery and potential joining, following by potential joining to the anti-bribery convention, and that is definitely supports the strengthened fight against corruption that is also required by the EU. The final example I wanted to mention is Sigma. Definitely, well, this was very helpful for my country, for Lithuania, on our way to the EU. Indeed, Sigma supported Lithuania in civil service reform, in developing of anti-fraud strategy, regulatory management policy reforms, and many other areas. So we strongly support the cooperation of Ukraine of Sigma working with Ukraine as well, and are ready also to contribute to that with our experts, because indeed good public governance and strong public institutions is really key now to Ukraine in the process of recovery and reconstruction.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the last point on behalf of Sigma, on behalf of all my colleagues. And Sigma's experience underpins what you have said about the complementarity of both accession processes, EU and OECD. Almost all of the countries that Sigma accompanied to the EU membership eventually became also OECD members. 3 of them are now in accession discussions, so there is really a strong convergence of both. Now we move again to the Western Balkans. Deputy Prime Minister Grkovska, what would be your selection of a public administration reform or element of public administration reform in general, and specifically for the Western Balkans that impacts or impacted positively trust in public institutions?
Well, to be honest, answer of that question is very simple, but at the same time very complex. I'm sure that we will all agree that to have a good public administration, we means that the public administration that should base on the principle of good governance, which means transparency, efficiency, accountability, professionalism, and responsibility of the public administration, but at the same time among the holders of executive power. Now, complexity comes when we start to talk about implementation. How we will come to the point to have the public administration that will be focused on the civil servant needs and to be a service of the civil servant and not to exist for them, for themselves. And that is actually the huge challenge for the Western Balkan countries, because how it is a process that cannot be made overnight. It is continuously ongoing, and I totally agree with the Slovenian colleague that it is actually never-ending process, but it's very important to be process that will positively progress. Because when we are talking about public administration reform, we are talking about changing the mindset, and that is the most difficult part to achieve. But at the same time, the reform in public administration, linked with the EU accession process, will naturally lead us to that point. To show the importance of the processes in North Macedonia, we have established for the first time the Cabinet of Good Governance Policy, in charge for good governance policies, which is I'm responsible for, which is based on 3 pillars: digital transformation of society, transparency and efficiency of institutions, and anti-corruption policies, which are very much linked. Nevertheless, they seem to be separated, and all of them are very much linked with the reform of the mindset and with the reform of the public administration. I would like to thank Sigma for huge support in these processes, which is very helpful. And having in mind that we have already became a NATO member country and we have started the EU accession process, the support and expertise in the reform, especially in this regard, will speed the process in the reforms and will naturally lead us as soon as possible to achieve the EU membership.
Thank you, and the pleasure is mutual. Mr. Sahrawi, what about the MENA region again? Public administration reforms, there are some strong moments, and there are very interesting aspects of public administration reforms, for example, in the area of digitalization, service delivery, and so on, even in countries without democracy. What are the strengths and weaknesses?
Now, okay, let me be maybe realistic and fair to start with, and then I will fall back, excuse me, on my dogmatic position. Indeed, I mean, a lot of the countries in the region have engaged in some sort of a reform. And if we look, for example, at, let's suppose, countries of the Gulf region, they have rather efficient administrations. There is no doubt about that common support of the welfare states that are in place. I've lived in that region for a while, and I can testify to the quality of public administration from a technical point of view. Okay, I will not go to further than that. Of course, when I say that, it is mostly geared towards the citizens of those countries, because in some of them, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, for example, the expatriate populations are larger than the local populations. And obviously, public administration does not serve the 2 segments in the same way. So we have to be aware of that. So it's a little bit of a different contest. But now yesterday I came back from Tunisia, again my home country, where I participated to a number of events on public administration, digitalization, training in the public sector, you name it. At the end of next week, I'll be going back to Algeria to participate in another event on public administration and local development. And I have my own institute, the International Institute of Administrative Sciences, is involved in the co-organization along with the OECD Sigma, by the way, which also I commend for the quality of their output in the region. Over the last 12 years, I've been roaming the region, and I've even created a network of public administration research in the region. So, and I have to say that at the end of this whole process, over 12 years, I have not seen much progress. or at least not sustainable progress. And in some countries, very little of it, or a continuation of the old things, that are not working well. One of the statistics that keeps coming back, and actually I've heard it no later than last week, is the level of distrust in public administration. I'll give you a number and then I'll come back to it to put it in context. For example, I think it was a UNDP presentation about Tunisia where they said that 65% of the people distrust public administration, which is 2/3 of the population. I'll come back to, as I said, to give context to that number. I also recently reviewed a book on public policy in the region with a focus on Egypt, and the level of distrust was even more marked there. As I said before, only in the Gulf countries, which have rather efficient administration, that level of trust or satisfaction tends to be higher. Now let me connect it to a dinner I had last week with some international consultants, with Gregor, of course, knows very well. They expressed frustration as why progress in public administration reform is not really forging ahead. My answer was that public administrations across the MENA region is not a technical body that delivers services, but it is an extension of the state apparatus. And if the state itself, has never been, if you want, reformed to be serving the citizens, then obviously public administration itself will not. Let me conclude by going back to the example of Tunisia. Before I said that 65% were not satisfied. Tunisia has 1 million people that work in the public sector. That's the army and the police included, right? For a population of 12 million. And mind you, 2 million live outside, which means that you have, and if you take an average family size of 3.3 or 3.4, and you remove redundancy, you end up with 3 million people living directly off public administration. So basically, these are the people that are probably satisfied with public administration, whereas the 65% is the rest of the population that are not. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. And the last word, and if you can be very short, because we were just informed that the other 2 parallel sessions have finished, so they're waiting for us to continue with the plenary. Mr. Bousquet, public administration reforms in EU enlargement countries, in the accession countries. How would you, in 2 sentences, one on the strengths and one on the weaknesses, assess the situation?
Okay, so I think this will also follow what has been said. First, public administration reform is a continuous process. So you need to see not only the picture at time T, but also, the progress. And the Sigma reports are excellent basis for looking at the 6 areas that are under public administration reform progress. So the first one, and I think this is something which is very much key to politicians, it's the services. Giving services to citizens. So, and particularly where we have seen a lot of progress is on the digital services. This is very clear. We've been a lot of progress. In Ukraine, of course, the achievements are impressive, even in war times. Albania, Serbia, so in many countries, could name them. Of course, our partners here. So it's impressive. Why? Because it's attractive for a politician. It is visible. It is also gives the impression of a modern state and that everything is working. And it's also good for limiting corruption. So this is very good. And it was made necessary by the COVID pandemics, the continuity of the service, with the lockdown and so on and so forth. So very good, very positive, still more to go, but we are on the right track here. Now, the negative part, if I may say, which is very much related to what also happened in the MENA region, is about human resources management and the possible, sometimes real, instrumentalization of public administration for exercising public influence. What we want is top civil servants that are integer, that are selected on a meritocracy, on a merit-based, that care about the majority and not a minority, and that do not have any conflict of interest or any affiliation with a political party. And what we see sometimes, in some cases, is inflated levels of administrators at top level in areas which are not needed. But in the areas where it is needed, I mean, there is not enough people. So that's something really that the partner countries need to look at. But looking more globally, I mean, maybe 3 challenges, and that will be my final words, Gregor, on the public administration reform, which is not only for the enlargement countries, the partner countries, but of course for, I think, any OECD countries and the EU member states, certainly. We need public administration to be an attractive employer. This is challenging. We can see also in some countries that, I mean, the young talents are asking us, I mean, is it good for me to work in the public administration? I mean, will I have the right conditions? One. Second, this world is full of crises. We are managing one crisis after the other. So the agility, and this is going to become the norm. So the agility, the capacity of the public administration to move from one crisis to another, which are very different by structure, is something which is key, and we need to reflect upon it. And the third point is very much the openness, and I mean, as a Deputy Prime Minister from North Macedonia said, I mean, the capacity, our problems are too complex to be managed by the administration alone. We need to partner and we need to work with civil society. So the capacity of the administration to be open and to enter into dialogue with civil society, to find the right solutions, to strengthen public trust is key. Gregor, I tried to be short. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers, and a special thank once again to Minister Nemčinov. Duže ďakujem, pane ministre. And we don't have a time for any long conclusions. I would only say in conclusion, all the best wishes to the countries of the Eastern Partnership, of the Western Balkans, of the MENA region, on their path of public administration reforms. And I will end with 2 words, which will say it all: Slava Ukraini.
Thank you very much, Gregor, and all the panelists for this very fascinating session. Please don't move, because you won't be allowed to have a coffee break like in the morning. We're running very late. So we're going to move to the plenary session, but we're going to open the doors for the people who were attending, participating in the other parallel sessions to join us. So if you need, you just have the time to grab a glass or a cup of tea, but then come back immediately afterwards, because we're going to resume with the plenary.
Hi, Frederick. Nice.
Well, actually, if you can, I'm going to call you stay with your panelists. All right, great. But they did. It's not me, who is it? Well, I think we're going to start. So the people outside, if they can hear me, I'm shouting so that people can hear me outside as well. But if you can bring people, those of you who are outside. Well, listen, I think we should get started. So